Promises of major reforms to budget process and spending as Godongwana tables Budget 3.0. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana indicated that major reforms are being considered to both state spending and the actual budget process when tabling a third version of the contentious 2025 budget in Parliament on Wednesday. The first two versions failed to secure political support inside and outside of the Government of National Unity, GNU, creating an unprecedented budget crisis for the country and raising the spectre of a possible collapse of the multiparty GNU itself, formed only months earlier. As anticipated, the latest version excludes earlier proposals to increase the value-added tax, VAT, rate, which lay at the heart of both the abandonment of the initial tabling on February 19, as well as the legal and political fights that ensued after the March 12 tabling. This, despite a big reduction in the VAT proposal in the March version to a 1 percentage point hike over 2 years, rather than the 2 percentage point immediate hike contained in the February budget review. In a briefing, Godongwana said there had been a failure to anticipate the changes that political parties expected with regards to the budget following the reality that no single party won a majority in the 2024 elections. He added that a new process of consultation was required, and that parties had also learned a significant amount about what was involved in legally amending a budget over the past few months. The process, he said, was necessarily cumbersome, as any change needed to meet the same thresholds of fiscal prudency and rationality to which the National Treasury had to comply when drafting a budget. The documentation released with Budget 3.0 confirmed that efforts would be made to enhance the budget process, with Director General Duncan Pieters acknowledging that it had not been a normal budget. For its part, the National Treasury is committed to learning from and building on this experience to ensure that our budget process remains highly transparent, accountable and faithful to our constitutional mandate, Pieters stated. The National Treasury indicated that government was also developing a framework for public participation as part of its review of the budget process. The review will help clarify the role of structures that provide inputs to the budget and enhance public consultation, the National Treasury said, indicating that changes to the process would be implemented over time. These reforms will be designed to strengthen government and institutional commitment to fiscal sustainability, refine budget prioritization and the functioning of budget structures, and improve data systems and capital budgeting, monitoring, and reporting. Priority would also be given to improving the efficiency and effectiveness of public spending, highlighting that previous reviews by the National Treasury and provincial treasuries of our 312 billion worth of spending programs since 2013 had identified savings of our 37.5 billion. These savings could be achieved by changing operating models, improving oversight, or closing programs that no longer achieved their intended objectives, with specific reference made to greater efficiency in procurement, information and communication technology and infrastructure management. Reforms flowing from the recent review of public employment programs and active labor market programs would also be implemented, after that review pointed to a mixed performance of the individual programs. A process was also underway to identify ghost workers and other payroll irregularities using a new data-driven approach to detect anomalies across national and provincial departments. If government achieves significant savings from implementing the recommendations of these reviews, it may mitigate the need for additional tax measures in the 2026 budget, the National Treasury said, adding that updates would be provided in the 2025 medium-term budget policy statement in October. The National Treasury was also consulting on the Fiscal Anchors discussion document published in March as part of identifying long-term measures to prevent a recurrence of the cycle of high spending, high deficits and high debt. Growth and budget revisions. Despite the exclusion of VAT hikes, tax revenue is still expected to rise from a 1.86 trillion in 2024-25 to a 2.29 trillion in 2027-28, representing a 61.9 billion downward revision from the March 12 proposal that included the VAT hikes, as well as more bullish growth projections than is the case in Budget 3.0. The minister confirmed that South Africa's economic outlook had weakened since his March tabling, and revised the country's 2025 GDP growth to 1.4% in 2025, from the March forecast of 1.9%. Medium-term GDP growth is expected to average 1.6% from 2025 to 2027, weaker than the previous forecast of 1.8%. The downward revision to the 2025 growth outlook remained above market expectations, however, as well as the 1% outlook included in the International Monetary Fund's most recent growth projection. The tax measures outlined for 2025-26 are expected to raise our 18 billion on the back of no adjustment to personal income tax brackets and rebates, an inflationary increase in the general fuel levy, and above-inflation increases in excise duties on alcohol and tobacco products. The National Treasury also indicated that these tax measures would persist until the 2027-28 financial year. Godongwana also announced that the 2026 budget would propose tax measures to raise additional revenue, including through efforts at the South African Revenue Service (SARS) to improve tax administration and raise compliance, as well as by directing resources to SARS to increase its revenue from debt collection by a 20 billion to a 50 billion yearly. Some are 4 billion had been allocated to SARS to improve tax administration, and Commissioner Edward Kieswetter indicated that 500 new debt collectors had been recruited and trained, with a further 250 to be recruited in June. Having recovered about our 95 billion in 2024-25, Kieswetter said it was targeting recovering at least our 120 billion during the current financial year on the back of the investments being made. Debt to GDP backslide. Nevertheless, the minister confirmed a 1.2% deterioration in the gross debt to GDP outlook, which is now forecast to peak at 77.4% in 2025-26, instead of the 76.2% forecast in March. The ratio would also remain elevated at 77.2%, 75.9% in 2026-27 and 76.7%, 75.1% in 2027-28. Gross government debt, meanwhile, is expected to increase from our 5.69 trillion in 2024-25 to our 6.09 trillion in 2025-26 and our 6.82 trillion in 2027-28. The gross borrowing requirement is projected to decline by a total of our 30.2 billion between 2024-25 and 2027-28, however, owing to lower projected spending relative to the March budget review. Debt service costs will consume 22c of every rand collected in revenue in 2025-26, and government will spend a 1.35 trillion servicing debt over the 3-year spending period. Total consolidated spending in Budget 3.0 is expected to grow at an average annual rate of 5.4%, from our 2.4 trillion in 2024-25 to our 2.81 trillion in 2027-28, with total spending additions over the 3-year horizon amounting to our 180.1 billion, as compared with the 232 billion outlined in June. Included in the additional spending is a 20.8 billion for compensation and essential services in health, including the employment of 800 doctors, our 19.5 billion for provincial education to safeguard about 500 posts, a 1.6 billion increase in social grants in 2025-26. Our 35.2 billion to extend the temporary COVID social relief of distress grant for a single year, our 23.4 billion for the 2025 public service wage agreement and carry-through costs, our 5.5 billion for the early retirement costs targeting about 15,000 public service employees over 2 years, and a 3 billion allocation to the South African National Defence Force for the Southern African Development Community Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including to cover immediate withdrawal costs. It also allocates an additional 33.7 billion for critical infrastructure projects, including support for projects approved as part of the Budget Facility for Infrastructure, investments in passenger rail, and 6.4 billion to reverse declining water, electricity, and solid waste services in cities. However, the minister warned that other spending pressures might arise later in the year, referencing in particular the funding shortfall that would arise as a result of the decision of the U.S. government to halt funding under the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief Program. The Department of Health was still quantifying the shortfall with the help of an accounting firm. The consolidated budget deficit for 2024-25, projected at 4.5% of GDP in the 2024 budget, is now estimated at 4.8%, but the deficit is projected to decline to 3.4% of GDP in 2027-28.